Live. All right. Hey,
Live.
everybody. This is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen Bookstore. And it is a real treat and an honor to have my good friend, Gary Phillips, with me here today. Hey, Gary, how you doing?
I'm fine, Patrick. Thanks for having me tonight or this evening or whatever time it is.
In these very strange days that we find ourselves in, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. I was talking to Joe Lansdale last night, and he was saying it's kind of like we're in I Am Legend right now.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. That's true. And we are. We're going to get right down to that one last person who actually has right the antivirus or the antibodies, but the antibodies stay with them. Right. Everybody gets them, or you get them and they go away. But this will be the one person, man or woman, who will have them and they'll stay with them. And then we have to catch that person and then use their blood all the time. Yeah.
Right. Let me give you the formal intro here, and I might embellish on what you have.
There you go.
Gary Phillips is the son of a mechanic and a librarian. He was weaned on too many comic books, Dashiell Hammett stories, reruns of the original Twilight Zone, and experiences ranging from community organizer to delivering dog cages. I didn't know about that one.
Yeah.
Let's see, his 1950s set graphic novel, The Bebop by Barbarians, riffs on race relations, jazz, police brutality, and the Red Scare. His novel, Violent Spring, was the first such mystery set in the aftermath of the 1992 civil unrest. And he edited the award-winning anthology, The Obama Inheritance, which I have a copy of right here, 15 stories of conspiracy noir. And then there's a kind of a follow-up in that same series just recently out called Faking the President.
That's right.
Yeah, Faking the President.
That's right. Both from Three Rooms Press.
Right. Let's see. He is the story editor on FX's Snowfall, about crack in the CIA in 1980 South Central, where he grew up. And I'm going to embellish and add, he's also the author of the Ivan Monk novels, the Martha Cheney novels, standalone novels such as the noir classic, The Juke, which is, we'll have to talk about that.
All right.
The Perpetrators, Bangers, The Underbelly, and many more. You've written and collaborated on others with various different graphic novels, including Peepland with the great Krista Faust.
Yes.
Vigilante, Southland, and others, Shot Callers, all kinds of, and my favorite, was it Bicycle Cop Dave?
Yeah, that's right. Bicycle Cop Dave. Exactly. That's right.
And, you've edited many anthologies.
Yeah.
And you always have various cool projects going. So we'll talk about that. And let's see here. And now we have the first in a new series, which we don't have copies yet, but we will have them soon. It's coming momentarily from Polis. And it's called Matthew Henson and the Ice Temple of Harlem. Just a blast of a book, Gary.
Well, thank you.
I know you've been talking about this book for a long time, a number of years.
Yeah, a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah. And can you just, I don't know, maybe talk a little bit about what inspired you to write the book?
Well, yeah, I as you know, I'm a hard-boiled writer, but I have a toehold in what they call the new pulp world or new pulp movement, where people take existing pulp characters, some of which have fallen into public domain, and they write new stories about these characters, right? And so I've done a little of that. And then for some odd reason, and I've known about Matthew Henson, and for those who don't know about Matthew Henson was among the first of 6 men to reach the North Pole above Greenland there. And Matthew did not get the accolades that Commodore Robert Perry did. And of course, nobody ever talks about the 4 Inuit gentlemen who were with them at the time. So for some odd reason, I guess Henson had been on my mind, and then I was sort of casting around at that point a couple of years ago, or maybe 2.5 years ago, thinking about what I might write next. And I kind of latched on the idea of Henson, but not a story about reaching the North Pole, which has been done, I think, in several instances, as well as there's even a fictionalized movie I recall from years ago with Lou Gossett as a kind of Matthew Henson character in the story. but I had never read his. It's not really autobiography. It's really more of a memoir. It's called a Negro at the North Pole, and it was published in 1912. And in it, he recounts the various, because it was the, I think, 7th or 8th attempt when they finally reached the North Pole. There's various attempts they try over a period of years to reach the North Pole. So this is finally the last time, or this 8th time they finally make it. So Henson sort of recounts these various times. Now, what was true was that Henson was the one. He was the only black member on any of the expeditions, but he was also the only one to ever learn the Inuit languages. And I always thought that was pretty interesting. So anyway, so I read his book, which is kind of dry and very staid. But this is all partly working on the notion of creating him recreating him, I should say, as a pulp hero. All right. So then, though, in the context of reading his book, there's just so happens the edition I bought has a foreword by Professor S. Allen Counter. And Professor Counter was a professor at Harvard. I forget what hard science he was versed in, but anyway, he was a hard scientist. But he was also something of a Hensonologist. And in that context, he wrote the introduction to this particular edition I have of Henson's book. So then I started reading more about Counter, because in Counter's intro, he alludes to some things that Henson doesn't go into. And so sure enough, I hunt down Counter's book, which is, I think it's called Black and Eskimo at the North Pole. And so as it turns out, both Henson and Perry had Inuit kids. Henson had a son, and Perry had a son and a daughter. And I believe the daughter died fairly young. I think the daughter dies in her late teens, early 20s. But nonetheless, here you have these two guys who have these Inuit kids, but they, in their official versions, they never mention these children. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So then I do, I'm reading Counter's book and I'm making some notes, and then I finally figure out, okay, I'm going to use Henson as a kind of pulp character in the vein of, in the mold, I should say, of Indiana Jones and Doc Savage. I'm not going to set him going to the North Pole, because, as I said, that story has been told and retold several times. But I do want to obviously allude to that, because that's what makes him the adventurer, makes him sets him up as our pulp character. And then so I figured out, well, I'll tell the story set in the late Roaring 20s, but particular then in the Harlem Renaissance in 28, because it's a great time period, right? And there's been there's been more than a couple of films, but that have sort of touched on the Harlem Renaissance. There's one film in particular I was thinking about from the 90s called Hoodlum, where Lawrence Fishburne, I think, plays a young Bumpy Johnson. But I wasn't interested in using Bumpy Johnson as a character. I was very much more interested in using Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie St. Clair. Now she's Cecily Tyson plays her in the movie, but she's really given short shrift. I mean, because the real Stephanie St. Clair is a very fascinating person. So I figured, well, I'll use her as the queen of the numbers. Dud Schultz is trying to crowd into the numbers game. I'll use Bessie Coleman, because she was the first black woman aviatrix. She and Henson, as far as I know, didn't know each other, but what the heck, I'm writing fiction. So I put her in the mix, and I put Tesla in the mix, and then somehow or another, it all worked together in a kind of plot to bring these people together. But in that time period, to also then, salt it with characters who were real in that time period, as well as in an amalgam of characters too. I should mention that my Jack Lake preacher character, Daddy Paradise, is actually based on two real characters, Father Divine and Daddy Grace, who were actually two real sort of figures of that time period. And I kind of combined them together to create this one character, which helps us set the plot in motion, as you know, which is that Henson has to go retrieve the man's kidnapped grown daughter. Dud Schultz has kidnapped him. Now, why has Dud Schultz kidnapped the daughter? We find that out. And then, of course, Henson, of course, gets the young woman back. And then we also find out what Daddy Grace is up to, what Daddy Paradise is up to as the plot gets rolling.
Yeah, and as you said, it's a wonderful kind of mashup of different styles. It's got everything but the kitchen sink thrown in there in terms of a pulp kind of a pulp novel,
Yeah.
but also a really fascinating recreation of the period,
Oh,
uh,
good.
of Harlem period. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about kind of getting down there on the streets and researching those details?
Well, I tell you, Patrick, I had known some of this for some time. I've never really actually I've written novels set in the past. This is the first time I've done this one with particular emphasis on the Harlem Renaissance. But I suppose from my own reading and my own research over a period of time, I had accumulated some knowledge, like Queen St. Clair, like Dutch Schultz, trying to crowd in the numbers racket, stuff like that. I knew, and I had these great resources, and but as you don't write these things to tell a history lesson because that's fairly dry. And the only thing that really makes it come alive, of course, are the people that you're putting on the page. And through them, you sort of give a sense of the time period and the place. And so that I knew that I knew I want to talk about the nightclubs. But I also want to talk about the sense of sort of Black empowerment. This whole question of there was a term then, I don't think I quite use it in the book, or maybe I do allude to it in the book, which was called the New Negro, which is to say, art and the things that they produced through music or writings all had to sort of uplift the race, and that was a constant discussion, in some of these salons they would have, whereas you would have somebody like Zora Neale Hurston who used a lot of course, dialect and such in her work, and she was considered, well, you really shouldn't do that, Zora Neale. You got to really be, everybody's got to talk proper, and everybody's got to be up to, good things and what have you. So, but in that firmament, I wanted to give some sense of that place and time where I'm putting Henson in the, into the mix, different than I think, and this is I think somewhat important to talk about. In the old pulp stories, which I'm a fan of, the Doc Savage stuff, the Spider, the Shadow, all that, and I guess Mr. Patterson is bringing the Shadow back.
Is that right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Because he's James Patterson. Damn it.
Is nothing sacred.
But in those books, a lot of it, which were set, were written in the Depression era, or sprang from the Depression era. A lot of times, you wouldn't even know what was going on in the real world because the books were so fantastic. I mean, even though they took place in New York, they took place on the city streets. There was a tendency to, of course, then downplay any sort of grinding reality. I guess partly because you wanted to keep the readers interested and keep them moving along in these fantastic yarns. And there's something to be said for that. But obviously, there's something to be said for in 2020. You have a very much more sophisticated audience, and also because you're telling a retro tale, you're telling a sort of revisionist history tale with a Black character, which you wouldn't have seen, in a pulp novel then, at least not a Black character as the lead character. So all that to say is that I understood that I had to ground Henson in a real world, as well as try to give you this crazy pulp story.
It's interesting you said 1928. If you think about that, about what's going on, it's such a fascinating time period in terms of what's to come very
Right.
shortly.
Exactly.
And you've got the kind of the jazz era decadence and style,
Yes.
and opulence and all of that, and then boy, it's not too much longer than you get
The crash.
Prohibition, depression,
Right.
and then the kind of the rise of the whole the real gangster era.
Yes.
With Prohibition coming in and all of that. And also, I think 1928, wasn't that Red Harvest, Dashiell Hammett? It might have been.
I think that's right. I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think 28, 29. I think that's absolutely right. That's right. 'Cause it was serialized at first, I believe. That's right.
Right.
That's right. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And then it's as you say, that whole pulp, the sort of the glory years of the pulp era,
Right.
Right before television. You have all these wildly inventive, pulp stories, Black Mask, and
Yeah, and the writers, and Hammett and Chandler, and what's the name? Earl Stanley Gardner created Perry. A lot of these guys started in the pulp. And the other thing about the pulps I always found fascinating was particularly particularly Doc Savage and the Shadow, right? Because the Shadow was number one, and Doc Savage was number two, right? And it's very interesting, right? I mean, the Shadow is a creature of the night. He has multiple identities. He's sort of twisted and weird and strange. And Doc is Doc, right? Doc really doesn't have. He doesn't have a secret identity. I mean, he's Clark Savage Jr. and they just call him Doc because he's a doctor of medicine, a doctor of chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. But he is sunlight, and the Shadow is the darkness. Right. And they're clearly templates for the Shadow is a template for Batman. Doc Savage is a template for Superman. In fact, Doc, even way before Superman showed up in comic books, Doc had his Fortress of Solitude, and he was called the Man of Steel, even though he was the Man of Bronze. But all that to say is that in those days, the pulp writers had to grind out, what they called a novel-length story, right? 50 to 60,000 words a month. And in the case of the Shadow, at one point, the Shadow was so popular they were doing, doing 2 issues a month. And Walter Gibson, was pretty much the main writer on the Shadow. And the story goes that Gibson had a railroad car that he owned, and he had the story goes that he had 4 or 5 typewriters lined up, right? And he would work on one Shadow story on one of the typewriters, and he'd sort of run dry or get hit a wall, and he'd start working the other one, and then he would go back to, and then he'd either go back to the other typewriter or go to the third typewriter. So the idea was that he was always 3 or 4 stories ahead in some degree of completion because of just the grueling schedule he had to maintain.
That whole era is so fascinating when you think about these writers, as you say, who were, they weren't sticking to one genre. They were selling whatever
exactly
a demand for. So there would be westerns, detective, fantastic tales.
Yes.
You had Hugh Cave and tons of other people like that. That were doing the same thing. And I was thinking about you were talking about a little bit about Henson's, real life history.
Yes.
And I don't know if you read Joe Lansdale's book. It's on my mind because we were talking about it last night. But he wrote a really fine novel called Paradise Sky, based on.
I have it on the short stack. Yeah, I do. Yeah. I'm going to get to it. Deadwood Dick.
Deadwood Dick, right?
Yeah. Right.
Who was written about? They changed his race, of course, in the Penny Dreadfuls or the early pulps. Made him white when he was actually black.
Right.
Reality. Were there and also what you're saying about him having those Inuit kids is really fascinating. There was an author a number of years ago now, a guy named James Welch who wrote he was a Blackfeet Indian writer, wrote some really terrific literary novels. But he was telling the story about how he was in France on book tour. Of course, anything about the West is very popular in France. But he was signing books, and this, obviously, Indian dude comes walking up to him, speaking French and stuff, and it turns out that he was the descendant of, back in the 1880s and 1890s, the Buffalo Bills Wild West show would be touring around Europe. And this guy was a Lakota man. He went AWOL. He went AWOL in France when they were on tour. And this guy was the descendant of one.
That's great. That's great.
Isn't that a cool story?
That's a great story. Yeah, that's a great story. And I should mention that in reality, neither, as far as I could tell, at least from Counter's book, neither Henson nor Perry ever saw those kids again. And in my book, at least try to, now being a grandfather and stuff, I think, well, you know what? I'm gonna give Henson a little bit more. At least my version of Henson, I'm gonna give him a little bit more credit there as a parent. And in the book, he laments that he hasn't gone back to see his son for several years, who's now at this point a teenager. And so part of the story is about him wanting him finally getting back to the North to see his kid.
Since your career is just, there's so much to talk about. I thought we'd take a little greatest hits tour Gary Phillips' career. And
Yeah, there you go. That'll put him to sleep. Yeah,
no.
that's
I think I met you first not too long after Violent Spring came out and
that sounds right.
Perdition USA.
Yeah,
When you and John Shannon and there was another author had started that publishing company called John Brown
that's right,
Books.
John. Well, John Brown Books was John Shannon's imprint, kind of through our bigger imprint, which was West Coast Crime.
Okay,
That's right. And we published Ed Goldberg. Ed wasn't really a partner. We actually paid Ed. We actually paid Ed a whopping $500 for his book as an advance, which actually served Cole, which actually wound up winning a Seamus, I believe, for best first novel.
Wow.
Yeah. How about that?
Yeah.
And then we all subsequently got picked up by Berkeley Prime
Berkeley.
Crime. Yeah.
Berkeley, yeah.
And dropped by Berkeley.
Yeah, no, John Shannon's a dear friend of both of ours.
Yeah.
I haven't heard much from him recently. I'll have to.
I've recently been more in touch with him lately. He and I, we haven't seen each other in a while, but we exchange emails now and then, particularly now coming out of the George Floyd stuff.
Absolutely. And speaking of, Violent Spring, 1992. Can you talk a little bit about? I know that that was very close to where you lived at the time, and in many ways inspired that first book.
Right.
You mind talking about that a little bit?
Well, other than to say that the idea of writing a mystery novel had been rattling around in my head for some time. Our buddy Gar Haywood had published his mystery novel, his first mystery novel, Fear of the Dark. I believe that's like 88, 89, 88 maybe it is even. And which was the St. Martin's Best First mystery novel, which still is, I guess still exists. And but Gar and I had known each other even before that, because Gar and I were both into comic books, and we knew each other in the days of what they called fandom, real fandom, where we actually had to print fanzines and you didn't have this internet stuff and all that. Anyway, all that is to say is that it had been on my mind. And because of my background doing community organizing and labor organizing, and I was working at that time for a Liberty foundation that then and now is still around, funded grassroots organizing. A lot of my work, I was the outreach director, so a lot of my work took me into various neighborhoods beyond South Central. So I could be at a meeting with some gang members looking to do some positive stuff in Nickerson Gardens in a housing project, and then I could also be downtown meeting with the Hilton Foundation people to talk about doing some kind of joint funding efforts. So my work took me all over the place. So when 92 jumps off, or the events of I should say in particular, of course, what we're talking about is when the verdict came in exonerating the 4 cops who beat Rodney King, among the 4 cops who beat Rodney King, but those are the ones that went on trial on criminal charges, and subsequently the riots, the civil unrest jumped off. And because I knew, like I said, I knew folks in the mix in that world, in that arena, I thought, well, here it is. Here's the material. I know this world. And what if I did have something that took place after these events? But of course, we would harken back to those events in the book. And then I would set in motion this black detective character, Ivan Monk, who I had created in a previous novel. The novel never saw the light of day. But I thought this is the thing that I can set him in motion around. I think this is the thing that I can write with some authority and bring to the page.
And how many Ivan Monk novels did you publish? 6 or 7?
No, there's only 4, and there's a collection of his short stories, and in my head has been the 5th, I guess it would be the 5th and final Monk novel that I'm probably gonna write in the next couple of years, but it will probably be set in the 90s, probably late.
Can you see this?
Yes, Monkology.
Best cover ever.
Best cover ever. That's right. Best cover. Our buddy Dennis McMillan.
Mr. Miller. Yeah.
So there's two versions. So that Monkology, there's 13 stories, and then Rare Bird Books did another edition with 15 stories. So there's two more in the Rare Bird Books
Really?
edition. Yeah, from the Monkology edition.
Now, obviously, was that a nod to Thelonious Monk at the
Absolutely,
time?
absolutely. I've always said that the name came from a couple of different sources. Ivan came from the actor Ivan Dixon, who played Kinchlow on Hogan's Heroes. For those of you old enough to remember that, and Monk came from two sources. Came from Thelonious Sphere Monk, or the pianist, but it also came from a guy named Art Monk, and Art Monk was a wide receiver for. Well, now the team finally has changed its name. The team whose name I should not say, that team from Washington, which finally changed that racial slur that they had for a name for many decades. But he was a wide receiver for them. He's in the Hall of Fame, and he always impressed me because he was not showboat. He was not into the glory. But he broke all these records. He'd always get open. And he would just say, well, that's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. And, and I just thought, oh man, what a, workmanlike guy, but but who's dedicated, you got the will, he's got the skills. And so both those monks then were in my head to come up with the name for the character.
Yeah, no, I just love those. I love those books. And every time I see you, I always urge you to write a new one.
Yes, exactly. Well, eventually I am.
I'm sure you hear that a lot.
Well, I'm getting long in the tooth, so I got to get to it.
And then you wrote the Martha Cheney novels, which were
That's right.
Which are really cool for Kensington.
For Kensington, yeah.
And
and one of these days I got to get back to another Cheney.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you see Cheney and Monk kind of living in the same world?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. I've toyed with that idea. I could see it. You know what? I could see it in a short story or maybe a novella. I don't think I could sustain it in a novel, but I certainly could see their paths cross in some kind of way. Either Monk is in Vegas or one of her jobs takes her to L.A., which is not is not unheard of. But I could certainly see their paths crossing. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Maybe that's right. Maybe that's the tune-up to get to the next Monk novel and to get to the next Cheney novel. I have them cross in a novella, which is kind of more surreal, and set in no particular time period. And then, that's not a bad idea. That's good.
Can you talk a little bit about the different forms? There's the short story form, and you've written loads of short stories and novels. Do you have a preference? If you, given your druthers, would you write short fiction or do you like them both? They pose different challenges.
Well, they certainly pose different challenges. And I'll say this for sure, Patrick. I think I'm working on a book now. And having now, in my golden years, done a sojourn in TV and writing, screenplays and writing in that form, which I've written before in that form, but to really get paid and show up and have to do it. And get notes on it. The long form is so much more luxurious in a certain way, right? Because you have all this real estate in which to tell a story. You can have subplots. You can get more into the character's psyche. But I think I've also figured out that obviously, as we know, it's also about pacing. It's also about keeping the story going. And there's highs and lows, and that doesn't mean there has to be action, but it does have to be that you have to have something happening on the page, that you're not just moving furniture around, that you actually are engaging the reader in what it is that you're doing, whether you're either advancing the plot, illuminating the character, or hopefully the best of worlds, you're doing both at the same time, right? Which is not always easy to accomplish, right. And because then you have to be very critical about what you've written. So I don't have, I guess, each form, and I've written comics and this and that, so each form has its own demands. But it certainly is the case that all of the forms, in the end, have to be about the story, right? Have to be about those people on the page, and have I hopefully done my job as a storyteller to keep you involved. And short stories, I think, well, they're great because they're short, right? But as you know, having edited these anthologies, you also it's also such a demand that I think you, even not to say you have to have a grabber, but I think you have to have something in that short story that you don't necessarily have to have in a novel. You have more time to develop, whereas a short story you don't have that time to develop. So in other words, you better get them engaged quick, and you better keep them engaged because time is going to run out. So I think I think I don't necessarily prefer one over the other. Although I will say, I guess what I was really going to get to was, now going back to long form again, I find it's wonderful because I have time to, elongate things and explain things. But I also have to figure out, well, I don't really want to be boring either. I have to sort of keep the story going. So I have to be careful that I don't go down too many tributaries and lose sight of what it is that I need to be telling you.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about your father and kind of he was a World War II guy, right?
Yes, that's right. He and both his brothers.
And tell me about him. And didn't he settle in or spend some time in France after the war? And
no, it's the other way around. Well, Pop, all three of the brothers from this little town, Seguin, Texas, and all three of them managed to get drafted. Pop went to Pacific. Uncle Norman is the one that went to European theater, and Uncle Sam was in India on the Burma Road. And it's my Uncle Norman, who was among the black expatriates who stayed in France after the war. But all three of the Phillips boys were mechanics, and so for a holiday, and Pop had a union job, so he had a pretty good thing in terms of like a month or a month and a half for a holiday when I was like a kid growing up, which I thought was like normal, right? That everybody had that long holiday. But for him, it was always what do you call it? A busman's holiday, right? So we would go to France they lived in the arrondissement right next door to Paris called Boulogne, and we would go to there. And Uncle Norman had a Ford. He sold French Fords, but he also had a garage, where he did repairs. So Pop was like working the garage. And I just sort of hang around and whatever. And then, of course, when I was a teenager, I could finally go off on my own. But so that was like our kind of like this odd little vacations where we just sort of, live with our relatives there in Bologna and, hang out and go places at night and stuff and go see go to the Seine and go see the what's that thing? The Eiffel Tower. I can't even remember nothing anymore. The Eiffel Tower. All that thing they got in France. Yeah. And the Champs-Élysées. But we go to the Louvre. Anyway, we just go all these places. It was like really trippy. But Pop is like working in his brother's garage. It's like hilarious. So yeah. But it was great. It was really very cool. It was a great, it's like something where as a kid you don't necessarily appreciate, whereas as you get a little older you think, oh, this is actually very cool. This is actually very hip. Yeah. And my uncle was like, because he was among the black expatriate crowd, like he knew James Baldwin, he knew Richard Wright. I got this great picture of my uncle with Joe Louis when he was over there, just sitting at this table laughing and stuff. And so yeah, it was kind of a trippy world, but it was a very cool kind of thing, Yeah.
Did he ever meet the great Chester Himes?
I don't know. I don't think so. I it's funny. Had I known then, what I know now, I would have asked that. But yeah, I don't because I don't recall him ever bringing up Chester Himes, and he would bring up some of the people that he knew or ran across. But I don't ever recall him bringing up Himes. Yeah.
Yeah, Himes, man. I hope he. It's funny how his popularity seems to kind of go in waves. There'll be a big resurgence of interest in him, but what an important writer.
Dig it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when that experience, it seems like as a kid, did that, even though you might not have realized it at the time, did it kind of influence the way you view the world? Your perspective on things?
Well, I think to a certain extent, or just the notion that
this wasn't it.
This was right. Well, this wasn't it, but also the notion that here are these guys who grew up, pretty poor, who grew up in the Depression and who grew up, I mean, Uncle Norman and my dad Dykes, when they got of some size, I mean, they're like, I don't know, 13 or 14, because Norman was a year older than Pop. They said, look, we ain't sticking down here on the farm. This ain't it. This has got to be something else. And they hit the road. They literally hit the road. They literally just got on the train and those hobo stories, man, they just rode the freight and wound up back east and different parts of the country because, man, they just sitting there, being poor on the farm was not going to cut it. So, yeah, they sort of took matters in their own hand and went off, whereas Uncle Sam being the youngest, and then my Aunt Margaret, the girl, they actually got to go live with our better off relatives in Kansas City, the Jackson side of the family. But the Phillips side of the family is the poor side of the family. So, yeah, the Phillips' man said, we got to go.
Now, was your dad part of the kind of the post-war economic boom in Los Angeles? Did he
to an extent, but this goes to show you, he had his job, Patrick, before the war. In fact, Norman had come out to L.A. This is Pacific Motor Trucking, which at that point was the trucking arm of the Southern Pacific Railroad. And Norman got the job and told Dykes, man, come on out here. I got a job waiting for you. Pop came out, got organized, helped organize some of the other black folks into the Teamsters, got drafted, goes overseas, comes back, and gets that same job back.
Wow.
So, yeah. So, and certainly at that point, you're right. There's the whole other migration of black folks coming certainly to the West, up to Oakland and down into LA, into the Valley, into the aerospace, particularly aerospace, right? But this is like, sort of the trucking part. But so yeah, he was like sort of, him and Norman was sort of like the pre-wave, you know what I mean? Before these cats were coming back after the war.
Now, at that time, the whole Central Avenue scene was in full swing, right?
Central Avenue was in swing. At the end of the war, it was starting to decline some, but that's the 40s, so it was still happening. It was definitely still happening, and by the time we get into, I guess, in the 50s, as sort of as somewhat the housing segregation in LA started to loosen up some, although not that great a deal. But as that started to loosen up some and black folks started to move a bit more further out, a bit further west, sort of at one point, at some point Crenshaw becomes the sort of the central avenue, right, of its time. But certainly the 40s in through the 50s, certainly by the late 50s now, some of that's starting to decline. But even then, even in the 60s, though, there was still a couple of clubs. There was the IT Club. And there was a couple other places that were still happening. In fact, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did a great piece in the LA Times, I guess about a week ago, when he talks about when he first came out to, when he was, I guess he was still Lou Alcindor then, right? When he came out to UCLA, this is 65. And he goes with a buddy of his who's from LA, and they go down to the IT Club to catch John Coltrane.
Wow.
Yeah, how about that?
Then you had the Ash Grove was still going, that club, right?
Yeah, but the Ash Grove was, I guess that's more into the 60s, and that's really a different part of town. That's on Melrose. They had black acts there, but the Ash Grove was not, it was not a black club. It was not part of that scene per se.
Right. A lot of the old, the revival of the blues guys.
That's right. Exactly. That's right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And so when you were coming up, where did you live at that time? Were you on Crenshaw, right?
No, we were in South Central. I was I lived on a street called Flower Street, between 59th Place and Slauson. And the clubs then, well, the big thing then, of course, was, there was Mavericks Flat, which that was the big club on Crenshaw. And there was another club, which I'm blanking on now. It was on Total Experience. It was a Total Experience. There was Mavericks Flat. And then, but even then, we go, like I saw Funkadelic at the Whiskey. I mean, you know what I mean? So, yeah. So things were like, definitely more spread out, definitely more venues or different venues in different parts of town that you would go to. And of course, then the big thing was to go to the Forum in those days to catch that, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
It's funny, you know, Paul Robeson kind of figures tangentially into the Matthew Henson book, or at least he's mentioned. He's mentioned a little bit, right?
Right.
I remember, I know the whole history of Los Angeles is so fascinating, and sorry for indulging us kind of my curiosity about this stuff. My grandfather was a LAPD cop back in the 40s and 50s.
Did I know that? I don't think I knew that. That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He died in the late 50s.
Yeah.
But, you know, you and I have had some fun times in LA. I remember one time, I appreciate it more and more as the years go by, but we went to that, wasn't it a birthday party for Frank Wilkinson?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And he was, as I remember, he would trap everybody he could and tell the whole story of
Chavez Ravine and
Chavez Ravine.
That's right. That's it. Exactly. Right. That's it.
What a fascinating, guy.
Right. Exactly. And immortalized in what's his name's record?
Ry Cooder.
Yeah, Ry Cooder's record. Yeah, exactly.
Don't call me Red.
Yeah, don't call me Red. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, of course, your work is associated with Los Angeles, you know, and there's so many wonderful books set in LA, and it's an infinitely fascinating landscape. Can you imagine yourself living anywhere else at this point?
At this point, probably not, Patrick. But then I'm too old to go anywhere else now. It's funny, it's funny you say it, because just recently, right, we've had the two miniseries set in 30s LA, right? The Penny Dreadful, City of Angels, and now this reboot of Perry Mason.
Right.
And both, by the way, use a Sister Amy character in their storylines. But yeah, so it is kind of this interesting, I don't know, revival or look at LA. And in fact, the book I'm working on is set very specifically in 1963 LA, which I was just a little kid, so I have no memory of it. But so it's fascinating to me to look up stuff, to read stuff about that very specific time period. And again, I'm using a character that's loosely based on a real person, a photographer this time. Yeah, I think as the mystery field has gotten more diverse in terms of people of color and women, etc., gay, straight, whatever, writing their stories, it certainly then requires that these hidden histories of LA, these hidden histories of all our cities, but these hidden histories of LA demand a kind of telling, if they haven't been told before, or a retelling from a different point of view than previously done. Absolutely.
And this is the Soho project.
Yes. Yeah. One Shot Harry.
What more can you say about it? It sounds fascinating.
I'll say this much: that the main character, I've again retconned a real person. The real person was Harry Adams, who was a part-time photographer and a barber. How about that? And he would have the police scanner going, in his barber shop, and he, hear something fascinating, you'd rush out, to get, somebody have a head cut. In my version, I steal a little bit. I willingly steal a little bit from the real life Ouija, right? The famous crime photographer of 40s New York City. Because Harry wasn't necessarily a crime photographer. Wasn't a crime photographer much at all. He did a lot of more society stuff. Well, he did a lot of stuff for. He was black and did a lot of stuff for the black weeklies as well as some of the slicks. And in my version, he's much more of a crime photographer. He's a Korean War vet. He's suffering from what we would now call PTSD, what we call the shell shock, and things happen. And in the very specific thing, without getting much of the plot away, is it's April '63 in L.A. Martin Luther King comes to L.A., and this is true. Martin Luther King came to L.A. He spoke at Wrigley Field, because L.A. actually had a Wrigley Field, which is where the AAA Angels used to play in South Central. And on partly it was to build up the audience for it and to help fundraise for what would be the March on Washington that August in back in D.C. But in my story, King is in L.A. Certainly, obviously, certain things are going to happen, but and then Harry gets finds himself in the middle of stuff that's going down as he tries to pursue his gig as a photographer.
Wow,
crime photographer, is it?
That sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think I'm
I think
actually enjoying it.
Was it the last monk? My memory is fading a little bit, but wasn't there a part of that book set in a barbershop? And
yeah, well, there was always a monk. Yeah, Monk always there was a barbershop that Monk always frequented, and we would often have just scenes of him hanging out with these cats in the barbershop.
And you hear this
talking.
great kind of all these different stories from
right, always talking smack. And there was a retired postman. There was a guy who was a carpenter. Yeah, so these various characters are always sort of there, and he would never use them in any of his cases, but they would always talk to him about his work, right? Because they were always wanting to find out what he was up to. Now,
are any of those places still around, or are they kind of fading fast?
No, I mean, some of those places are still around. I mean, actually, we've closed our barbershops again, but I actually go to a barbershop. I used to go to two barbershops. I used to go to a barbershop called Westside Cuts, which was in my old neighborhood. And I actually had two book signings I did there. Which
I remember that,
great. Yeah. It was a great place. And then that closed. And then now I go to a place called Headmaster. How about that for a barbershop name? And that's actually still also in my old neighborhood. So some of those places are still around, and you can still hear a bunch of people talking smack.
Let me see. It's funny. I started to bring up Robeson, and then I got derailed by my own train of thought. But, the only reason I bring it up is that I remember John Shannon. It was, he took me on a couple of these really interesting sort of underworld tours of LA.
Yes.
And we went to the Social History Museum.
The Southern California Library for Social Studies and Research.
Yeah.
But SCL, Southern California Library, yes.
Right. And we went in there, and it was absolutely fascinating because they had these big, kind of drawers that they
yes.
And I saw these original posters, hand-painted posters, like Los Angeles welcomes Paul Robeson.
Right, dig it, right.
And just amazing stuff like that.
Right, exactly. And they've got a lot of photos from the California Eagle, which is one of the black news weeklies in Los Angeles. And it was actually much more of a lefty paper. Charlotta Bass was the publisher, and she herself was very progressive. Much more so than the Sentinel, though I'm not disparaging the Sentinel. The Sentinel did play this role too, but the Eagle was in a lot of ways much more out front, much more out there than the Sentinel in terms of a lot of social issues. Right,
and now you mentioned a little bit about all the different kind of some of your influences, which are all over the map. That's one of the things I love about your work is that it pulls from so many different places. You mentioned Conan Doyle and Hammett and some of those folks, but you also mentioned Donald Goines and people like that. Were some of those authors like Goines and Iceberg Slim and some of the Holloway House writers were they around when you were growing up, and were they influential to you?
Well, I mean, yes, they were around. I mean, because they were writing for Holloway House, and Holloway House was the kind of paperback originals you couldn't find. At least in those days, you couldn't find them in a bookstore. You'd find them at the thrifty drugstore, or the spinner rack in the bus station, or at the Ralph's supermarket. Holloway House is very interesting, right? Because as we know, Holloway House was this white publisher here in L.A., but supposedly then captured the black experience. And so exactly that. So they had guys like Donald Goines, Iceberg Slim, Robert Beck, who actually had been a pimp and who wrote about that. But he's actually a pretty good writer in a fictionalized way. And in fact, he's the one that helped to influence Goins. Joe Nazell, who I knew slightly, was one of their other writers. And so definitely, I mean, along with the stuff you've mentioned, and Ross McDonald and what have you, or Richard Wright, it's certainly the case that those guys and their, I guess we would now call it, I guess, street lit or urban lit, but they certainly influenced me as well in terms of capturing that kind of scene, that kind of underbelly of the world. I mean, because they were essentially crime writers.
Right, and then there's other guys that like Robert Dean Farr and
yes,
Clarence Cooper and
right.
Lots of interesting writers that
exactly
Norton brought back for a minute, and then they went back out of print, right?
Right, that's right. He's right. Or my man who wrote Howard Street and A House of Slammers.
Nathan Hurd.
Nathan Hurd. There you go. That's right.
Yeah, those are terrific books.
Yeah.
And then Vern Jones.
Jones. Yeah.
Vern Smith.
That's right. The Jones Men. That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and Ross, a lot of people don't realize this, and I've got a couple of them sitting on my shelf. Gil Scott Heron wrote a couple of different books, The Vulture, which is pretty good, and a couple other different books novels that he wrote, pretty damn good.
Was that The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, right?
That's the man.
Yeah. Whitey's on the Moon. Isn't that his?
Yes.
Let me look there. Let me see if I have some questions from our audience here.
The slings and arrows.
Yes. Okay. Steve is asking about some of the. He also says he wants more Monk. He's asking about Musso and Frank's. If you ever go there, it's kind of
LA. Yeah, old LA. Yeah. I go to Musso, but I tell you, the real old school steakhouse that I go to, and it's not too far from me, is called Taylor's, and it's in what now is called Koreatown, but it's right once you step into it, it's like you're stepping into an episode of Mannix. So I just it's like that kind of decor. Yeah, that kind of 60s decor. And the steaks are pretty good, I have to say. So I'm looking forward to when I can go back there, at some point. Yeah.
So what's your take about this batshit crazy reality that we find ourselves in right now?
I don't know, man. I mean, there are just so many interesting and odd dimensions to it, and how it's become political, et cetera, et cetera. So, no sense bogging us down in that. But just to say that it is interesting to me. What I find fascinating, and I guess this always gets us back to the human condition, is that just not to get into the whole political thing about it, but just about the debate about mask or no mask, which apparently was a debate. Was it 100 years ago during the so-called Spanish flu? Right? The exact same thing. That the whole big hue and cry about it, and big rallies about not wearing a mask and all that sort of stuff. So it is fascinating. I mean, to that degree, it is fascinating about us as human beings, and how far along on the evolutionary scale are we?
Yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up here. Tell me a little bit about the experience of writing for Snowfall.
Well, as I said, Patrick, it was I've had, several of my novels, a few short stories, and even a graphic novel or two optioned in the past. So I've had a little foothold, a little foray into Hollywood, and I've done, because everybody's in Hollywood, I've done my share of pitching a TV show now and then. But because Mr. Mosley's on the show, he's been there from the beginning, and because at the time then Mr. Singleton, who was alive and one of the creators of the show, they called me in, and I did the interview, and there you go. And so it was I had from friends of mine who been showrunners and have worked in Hollywood. I had some sense of how the writer's room works, but it's a very much a different experience, because you're sitting there, man, 8 hours a day or whatever it is, you're pitching ideas constantly because you're trying to, as they say, break the story, right? You're trying to break the episode. You're trying to say get from point A to point B, and in our case, we've got several main characters that we've got to keep in motion. We've got to sort of make sure that their lives cross, and yet also diverge. There are times when, not to give anything away for this, whenever it is we get this to the new season, whenever that gets finally filmed. Although we were starting to film it and then we had to shut down because of the COVID-19. It drains you. I mean, that's really the answer. The answer really is, at least from my perspective and from what I understand from other writers as well, you're just, at the end of the day, man, you got no gas left to do anything else because, man, you've left it all on the table. And there's a whole lot of ideas that we run with for a few days, maybe even make it to the stage of being put on a index card and put up on the board, and then we just take it all down. And there are ideas that I would easily use in a book, but because it's a vision, but because this is TV, and because it's TV now, particularly in the time of post, or what's going to be post the murder of George Floyd, Me Too, etc., and because TV is shorthand, there are certain things that we know, we talk about it in the room and we're honest with each other in the room, but we also know that we cannot do that in a TV show. At least if we do it, if we show a certain scene or do a certain thing, if we don't have the time to really explain how we got there and what's the fallout, then we're doing a disservice to doing what we've shown. So I'm not giving anything away to say that there are things that I could do in a book and have the real estate to go into and sort of deconstruct, but you can't. It's hard as hell. You can't really do it on TV. So there's a lot of great ideas, or a lot of rugged ideas we come up with that we know in the end we can't do it because of all these factors. Right. So so all that to say is that, at least as far as my experience has been on the show now from 2 seasons, it's been a great experience. I mean, it gets live in the room now. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we don't hold back on each other's. But having said that, at the end of the day, I think we're all working, at least from my perspective, we're all working to try to make this thing as good as we can make it, given the subject matter we're dealing with, and given we're talking about a young man who was a drug kingpin who is destroying his neighborhood in South Central. So we can't. So on one hand, we're telling you a gangster story, so that means there's a certain glorification going on, and on the other hand, because we are dealing with a thing that really happened, at least insofar as what crack did to South Central, we can't shy away from that, and we also can't shy away from, at least from the story we're telling you about this CIA, this individual CIA agent and his role, his complicity in that what happens, right, in that destruction.
Did you happen to see George Pelecanos' the show that he worked on, The Deuce?
I did not. I watched some of The Deuce. It did not hold my attention as much as The Wire, but I did see some of The Deuce. Yeah, but then some of it, I just thought. I mean, I don't know. It didn't quite gel for me. I guess that's the word I want.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny. I mentioned Peepland at the beginning.
Yeah.
And what a terrific piece of work. And what was that like? And you and Krista collaborated together on that, and as well as the illustrator. What was that whole process like? Was the collaborative process of that?
Well, for us, it turned out pretty well. I mean, Krista was the authority, so all I'm bringing to the table is a little bit of knowledge of comic book 101. But other than that, I mean, but although then we collaborated on when we did the prose adaptation of The Killing Joke. And then we, since then, and since we didn't wind up at each other's throats, we are now collaborating on another project we hope to, get down the road. So, from my standpoint, I think from her standpoint too, I mean, it worked out pretty well. I mean, in the sense of, give and take, and in the sense of we would always talk about the story before writing the story, so that we would try to hammer out who does what, and then because we would do different sections, and then we would sort of bring it together, and we try to meld it together in terms of the language, in terms of how it sounded, and then before we would turn it in to the editor, then obviously way before then it got to the artist. So it turned out to be a very good process.
Right. Yeah, she's damn good.
Yeah, she's damn good.
It's funny. I've never met her.
Yeah.
I've just kind of admired her stuff from afar.
Right.
And my heart goes out to that Boston Terrier of hers.
That's right.
Django.
Django. Yeah.
Well, Gary, hey, thanks so much for spending some time with me today.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.